I realize we've thrown a lot of material at you in the first several classes, and it's tough because I'm not always able to give you a really good reading source that's very concise. So I'm going to trade that off and give you a very good test review. I'm going to go through the slides fairly quickly, and I'm going to point to parts of the slides or tell you particular issues that you should make sure that you're familiar with. I'm not saying that you're going to need to everything you're going to need to study. You're just going to be able to get by listening to this video, but it's going to point you to specific parts in your notes and perhaps to some readings that you should go back over. So um, to begin, I would know the difference between light and heavy and sweet and sour and why those differences are important, what economic consequences they have. I'd also know how many gallons are in a barrel of oil. I ask you in class to discuss some things that happened in the first 10 years of the oil industry that are pretty pivotal to the way things are today. And I would expect that you will probably be asked to do something very similar to that on the exam. We also talked about Standard Oil and how they were able to control a lot of the early oil industry by being a dominant refiner as opposed to something else. And even though they did move into the other streams, it was the downstream business and in the refinery that they were dominant first. You do not need to worry about years that things happened in places in Texas. However, the black giant, we talked a lot about the black giant, and there were several consequences to what happened with the black giant. So make sure you're ready to talk about that. And if you notice, both the places where I referred you to the prize video, I said big things happened there. Nothing on the Seven Sisters. We did talk about OPEC, and we want to think about how OPEC is influential today. Remember that OPEC controls the majority of the world's proven reserves. However, they don't necessarily have the largest producing countries, especially because remember, Russia is not technically a member of OPEC, even though they cooperate with OPEC in an attempt to get more pricing power. So when it comes to all this history through price, nothing in particular there. However, we talked about the impact of supply and demand, and we talked a long time about this chart and what caused the big price reduction in the 2014 through 2016 time frame. I would definitely be ready to talk about supply, demand, speculation, and what it means or what it meant in this time frame. We talked about off this slide how countries with lots of reserves don't necessarily do lots of production. Remember, we also talked about the tar sands of Venezuela and Canada and what's special about them. And even though they're very large reserves, they may not be quite as useful. Make sure you understand why about the tar sands. We talked in class about why this huge increase in U.S. oil production, and I would be up on why that happened. And then we talked about the impact of the midstream and the downstream industry, and we illustrated that by looking at the spread between WTI and Brent. And I would make sure I know what happened to the fact that the spread between WTI and Brent closed so much when the U.S. lifted its export ban. Why was that? And even though we see that it's crept up some in the outer years, this was a seminal point with the lifting of the export ban. Also, remember these photos are from Cushing, Oklahoma, and you're going to want to know why Cushing, Oklahoma is important. It has to do with NYMEX and stock price and things. I'm not sorry, not stock price, but spot price. And I would also make sure I knew what the spot price meant. Then I gave you some articles. I particularly pay attention to the article about Saudi Arabia, peak oil versus peak demand. Specifically, this idea of peak demand and how that factors into people's thinking about the future of the oil industry. We talked about the decrease of coal and the increase of natural gas in the electrical generation. Make sure you understand why that happened and some of the broader consequences. Dr. Meadow did a great job in his slides, but remember, I want you to know where the Bakken is, and I don't know why it doesn't say the word Bakken here. I want you to know where the Bakken is, the Permian Basin, the Barnett, the Eagleford, and the Marcellus. You're going to need to know where those things are for the exam. And I don't think there was anything on the rest of that slide. So I'm going to pause, change slide decks, and be back to you. Next up is the review slide deck that Dr. Meadow covered in class. It's going to be very important that you're quite familiar with the differences between conventional reservoirs and unconventional production. So make sure you understand these slides very well. So all of these slides, and again, he covered them in his original lectures, and then he covered them in class, so you've heard them multiple times. If you have a question on this, go back to his longer lectures to look through those. When we talk about the life cycle, remember that by comparison, unconventional wells tend to decline initially at a much faster rate than do conventional wells. And when you look at this life cycle, it doesn't assume IOR or EOR techniques happen. No numbers off of this, nothing about well logging. There's a test question on decline curve analysis. So I've already covered some key topics on the decline curve analysis, but I would also make sure that I read everything in here. And remember that Dr. Meadows' conclusion was when it comes to unconventional wells, they still really don't have a great handle on how to do a decline curve analysis for an unconventional well. Not that they don't try, they're just not proving to be all that accurate. Let's see, again, here's more on unconventional versus conventional. This is a very nicely marked slide that's got all of the shale plays. So this is the slide you want to make sure you can use to study. Talked a lot about fracking. Notice that a couple of key things, the fluid from hydraulic fracking is 99% water. And then you've got sand. So it's 90% water, then sand. So when it comes to the liquid part of it, it's 99.5% water. And then you have 5%, which is these things here, most of which are common household ingredients. Then he talked a lot about the hydraulic, or I'm sorry, in his longer presentation, he talked about the earthquake problem in Oklahoma. And the key thing is that fracking itself is not associated with earthquakes, not things, at least not ones that you can feel at the surface. When Oklahoma, and to a much lesser extent, Texas, had problems with earthquakes, it was because of disposal of the water that was produced from these unconventional wells, and that they were pumping too much volume of water at too high a pressure into the disposal wells in Oklahoma, and that's what was causing the fracking, or I'm sorry, causing the earthquakes. And again, he talks about this. Remember that there's enormous, usually thousands of feet between the aquifers and where the fracking is actually occurring. Make sure you know the difference between the Delaware Basin, the Central Highlands, and the Midland Basin. And this chart is the one that really points it out. This is what when people talk about the Delaware, this is where they mean. Notice that this is the very western part of Texas and southeastern Oklahoma. If you're in the Midland Basin, this is what people are typically talking about right here. And notice that that's right in the heart of Texas. So there's the town of Midland and Odessa right there. Then you have the Central Basin, which is between the two. And the way I remember that is even though Delaware is on the east coast of the United States, it's actually west of Midland in the Midland Basin. And I think that's got us covered for geology. Hang on. For the leasing review, I'm going to use my slides from the video lectures, but what Mr. Carter talked about in class is a nice complement to this. And so just sitting through the class, you've got a lot of the key issues with this. when it comes time to answer the questions on the exam, there's no direct question off of this slide, but understanding the concepts of this slide is going to really help you if you're kind of struggling on a question. That will tend to help you be able to figure out what is true. So the least basics is where the questions are going to come from. So what is being conveyed, for how long, and for how long is often one of the heavily litigated matters. So I would know each of these various parts and terms of the lease. So I'm telling you, know these terms. Also, I talked about in the video of the consideration, and that in the past, 1/8 was a typical royalty, but today it's more on the order of a quarter, or maybe if you're lucky, a fifth. And the key thing is that royalty is paid before most expenses are taken out, but after taxes. So that's the big deal of the royalty, is it does not include expenses. I don't think I've got anything on any of these clauses. So that's it for the exam. What you can expect are 20 multiple choice, and then some short answer, fill in the blanks, maybe matching to parts of the map that go correspond with the various major shale plays that are active in the United States today. I think if you take the time to look up the material we've talked about on this video, you are going to do outstanding on the exam. Good luck.